So I am here with Jamie from Soteria Planning, and I wanted to get you in, Jamie, because you own a business which I think is very, very relevant to the property journey of when people move. But also, I think it's probably something that people don't think about on their checklist when they're planning a move, something that they really should do, and it's really important. And for the people that are listening or watching, the experience for me over this year has been so relevant to this conversation we're going to have. I've lost three people, unfortunately, in my family, two at sort of grandma age level, elder generation, and someone, unfortunately, was much younger. So for me personally, actually experiencing this process over this year of what happens, whether people have the right will in place, have a will in place at all, it's been quite interesting, quite eye-opening. So I thought people would probably benefit from us having a conversation about why you should make sure you've got the right will in place when you're planning or when you've just moved home. So first of all, thanks for joining me.
You're very welcome.
And how is business?
Business is very good. Business is very busy. So to crack on and answer your question straight away. I mean, when people buy a property, whether they've got one and they sell it and buy a new one, or whether they're first time owners, let's be honest, your property is probably always going to be your biggest asset. It's something that you take 30, 35 years to pay off.
Yeah.
It's always going to be your biggest asset. And sometimes I'll talk to people and they'll say, I don't need a will because I haven't got any assets. And I'm like, well, your property is probably going to be your biggest ever asset.
Yeah.
Now, there's a number of factors that can be really, really important for people when they've bought a property, and it depends on what stage of the journey they're at. I'll give you an example. You get younger people, first-time buyers, that tend to buy property together, where maybe one of them has put in a certain amount of money, or they've got some money from the bank of mum and dad. We see that quite a lot. What they do is they set up the property so that it's owned as tenants in common with a deed of trust that says this person owns the first X, or this person owns X amount of the equity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's really, really important to understand, because 9 times out of 10, that couple that are buying the property together aren't married.
Mm-hmm.
So it means that without a will, there's no automatic claim on the estate. Now, without a will, if one of them was to pass away, their share would pass via what's called the laws of intestacy, which basically means you haven't got a will, you've died intestate. That's what happens. A very simple will, could basically say...
Just on that then, what is the layman's example if that was to happen? So my first property I bought with my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, we did exactly what you just said, actually.
Yeah.
I think it was 70k in as the deposit.
Yeah.
I was a little bit older than her, so I'd made some money in property. I put 70k in. We went on to the mortgage kind of 50-50, but we put the deed of trust in place that meant if we were to split up and sell, I would be due my 70k deposit, and then we would split things 50-50.
Yeah.
But had I passed away in that scenario, what would have happened to the 70k and the 50% of equity that I, in theory, owned if I didn't have a will? Because at the time I actually didn't.
Yeah. So without a will, intestacy would have said that your asset, so your share of the property included in that asset, would have passed to your parents.
Mm-hmm.
If your parents weren't around, your siblings, and so on. There's a chart that basically means it will find someone.
Yeah.
At the end of the chart is the government,
Right.
but that's very, very, very rare. So you can see already the solicitor or the estate agent or the mortgage advisor, whatever professional is involved with that first time buyer's journey, needs to say to them, you need to write a will.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes if somebody doesn't have a will, some assets will pass by what's called survivorship. And that means that a will is almost irrelevant on some assets. I'll give you an example. A jointly owned bank account and a jointly owned property.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got a jointly owned bank account and a jointly owned property, the definition would be that both people own 100% each. And in the scenario where one person dies, they very simply get removed from the asset. So on the property, it could be you do a form called the DJP form, deceased joint proprietor. You remove that person from the property. Surviving person owns 100% of that property. It's exactly the same with a jointly owned bank account. one of the biggest problems I see is that not many people know how they own their property. If
Yeah.
I said to a couple, how do you own your property? They're going to say jointly, because
Mm.
that's what they think.
Yeah.
But whether you're joint tenants, which is 100% each, or whether you're tenants in common could be 50-50, or it could be unequal with a deed of trust. People don't tend to know.
Mm-hmm.
In my experience, I think in my lifetime, I've bought 3 properties. Each time, as part of the solicitor paperwork that we receive, one of the last pages says that we recommend you write a will. Here's how you can do it. For me, that needs to be in bold. That needs to be mentioned more than once. And it needs to be as part of that process. So when you're buying a property, you'll speak to the mortgage advisor about putting life insurance in place, about putting home insurance in place. You need to make sure that you've got everything covered. The majority of mortgage advisors will hopefully make sure that will is in place as well. They'll refer a reputable company to be able to sort that out. But we need to make sure that it's easy for a client to be able to do that as well.
Yeah. It's a difficult conversation, isn't it? Because it's a bit of an awkward one to talk about you passing away or your partner at the time passing away. And I think over the years, I must have had, I don't know, I must have had 20 mortgages over the years on remortgages or different purchases, but only one broker has ever raised it with me. That was the most recent one, actually, of what have I got set up with my will. So I don't know whether it's a topic of conversation a lot of brokers are prepared to have, but you would hope they would because it's the logic behind it. But it's not a really expensive process, is it? Depending on how complex you want to get with it, it can be obviously expensive depending on how complex. But for standard kind of, 2 people entering a property that haven't got kids and they want to just make sure X goes to X and Y goes to Y, it's something that really every buyer should do very quickly after exchange, I would say.
I mean, if you're comparing it to the fees of actually purchasing the property, which are usually around 12, 13, £1,400,
Yeah, yes,
our
legal
fees
fees.
are nowhere near that.
Mm,
Now, of course, the cost of writing a will can really differ. You could go to a company that might be prepared to do it for you for £20,
mm,
up to a company that's going to charge a professional fee.
yeah.
We will charge a professional fee, but we will be expected to offer a professional service.
Mm.
We would want our clients to receive value from what we're offering.
What would you say is the most recent kind of known or celebrity status example where someone has kind of almost messed up a little bit by simply just not having a will or the right will in place? Is there any that have spring to mind from a media point of view for people to relate to?
So there's a couple that have been a really good scenario. Helen McCrory, is that how you say it? The
Maybe.
Peaky Blinders star.
Yeah, yeah.
She wrote a will. She passed away, I believe, with cancer. Her husband at the time, Damian Lewis, I believe they've got children together. There's something I read that said, please try not to get with another woman until at least the end of the funeral, all joking aside. And it's come about that actually she's put all of her assets in trust for her children, for her husband. And the idea of that being that if her husband was to meet somebody else, was to get remarried, that her children will always be protected. Now, of course, that's probably a bit more of I wouldn't say complex, but a bit more of an in-depth will, not something that everybody needs to look at.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a scenario where actually she's 100% done the right thing, because I believe that he has actually met someone else, is now happy
Right.
again,
Yeah.
which of course she might have wanted, which is fine, but she's done the right thing. There was also a scenario, I think, 2 years ago, where unfortunately Caroline Flack, who took her own life,
Yeah.
obviously wasn't prepared for anything like that happening. And the inheritance tax bill at the time was pretty tough, pretty
Mm.
horrible. Now, I'm not suggesting that by doing a will, any of that would have been easier for her family, but I believe that these people, whether it be celebrities, whether it be first-time buyers, everyone is influenced by somebody.
Mm.
And what we need those influencers to be saying to people, get your affairs in order. but don't just put your affairs in order and tick it off and put it away. Make sure you look at it. Make sure you look at it every 3 to 5 years, or every time there's a life change. You move house, you have a child, you get married, you get divorced. Those are real trigger points for
Yeah.
actually, let's look at everything I've got.
Yeah, it's a difficult conversation to think about, especially with your partner, but it has to happen. And I think for people that have bought recently, definitely, if you haven't got a will in place, have a conversation with Jamie. You can message us if you want to get in contact, but have a conversation. For people looking to buy now, especially around here, where I think there's a lot of first time and second time buyers that maybe haven't got children. Unfortunately, the area we're in, I know it's the way of the world these days, but there is a lot of divorces, splits, and you just don't know what's around the corner. So if you want to protect all the money that you've earned and that hard-earned money and make sure it goes to the right direction down the family tree, then this is a really important conversation to have. And obviously the advice that you can give someone in that conversation is going to be tailored and relevant to each individual. So you can't come on video and we can create an example for everyone because everyone's circumstance is different. But I thought it was really relevant to do this video, and I really appreciate you coming on and chatting with me because, like I say, I actually hadn't been to a funeral in 20 years until this year, and there was 3. And it just makes you think, I've got 2 young kids. My will is in place to make sure that what I want to happen with my money that I've worked very hard over my life to earn goes to those kids in the right direction. So
But if we look at you as a personal situation, since we've written your will, you've started a business, you've had a child. Now, obviously, those are things that can be factored into a conversation.
yeah,
But if they weren't, and if the will was written at the time, and then you have a second child and you have a business, they're massive trigger points to re-evaluate your planning. One final tip for me is I often get people that, of course, might want to buy their property together. So they might take some advice from someone, an influential person around them that says, well, if you die, the other person will get the property. So it's okay. You don't need a will. And in that situation, that's strictly true. Okay. Obviously, things like personal assets and cash and other things might not go and that might be lost. But in terms of the property, strictly true. Well, what would happen if you both died? And that's a question that nobody ever thinks about.
yeah, because you
But
could be in the same car
could
or
be in the
anything.
same car, same plane. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
And you've got this asset. Let's be honest. What's the initial investment around here for a property? £400,000.
yeah, average house price. Yeah,
It's got to go somewhere.
yeah,
Most people will have an insurance policy that pays off a mortgage on death. It's got to go somewhere.
yeah,
Where do you want it to go?
yeah.
So
It's scary stuff. The advice is so relevant. It's something that I just think is underestimated. In my 20 years as an estate agent, it's only in the last couple of years I've started advising people about this because it wasn't on my radar, being honest, but it needs to be on everyone's radar. And a lot of people have bought property in the last couple of years. And if it's not something they've got in place, use the contact form on this video or DM us via the social media posts. We'll get you in contact with Jamie, get yourself protected, get yourself in the right position. And it's just worth having a call for a check anyway, isn't it? Even if you're not 100% sure whether it's right, you may think you have a will in place, might not be the right version of what you actually want. So get in contact with Jamie, and thank you for your time.
thank you, Ian.